wonderful to be talking to you today. My name is Bruce Momjian. I am employee of Enterprise DB, been with there for, I guess, 15 years now. April 1 was 15, I think. Yeah, it's amazing. Been with open source since the early 90s, Postgres since 96. I am going to be giving one of 4 different talks that I have about cryptography today. You can see the slides of my talks here on this this URL right here. So if you'd like to, download these slides or look at the other 3 sets presentations I have about cryptography, you're welcome to do that. There's also dozens of Postgres talks on there, as well as recordings of many of my talks. So it's kind of cool. You can follow along to this talk or any of the other ones. The reason I wrote this set of talks, which totals 300 slides, is because obviously I've been in the industry for many years. And about 4 years ago, I realized that when I would talk about cryptography to customers or working with it within the community, I could be conversant and sort of sound like I knew what I was saying. But there was a sense that I didn't fully understand all of the levels of cryptography going all the way down. And I had a summer where I wasn't traveling. I normally travel about 90 days a year and I do about 40 events a year. Although, as Todd pointed out, every time All Things Open was scheduled, I was in Europe every time, it seems. So I could never justify flying back from Europe for All Things Open and back again, even though Philadelphia and Atlanta are not that, and Raleigh are not that far. I was never in the United States actually during the events, and that was disappointing. I was able to do the online one in the fall, and hopefully I'll be able to do the one this year. But anyway, I had a summer where I wasn't super busy, so I went to my boss and said, I've always really kind of struggling with cryptography and understand exactly what's going on. I really like to read some books and study this so I could be like the expert, because we don't really have any experts. We don't have many experts in the community. We had very few experts in the company. So I spent 6 months, read 4 or 5 books on cryptography, and then developed this set of slides and tried to really separate out cryptography from the bottom up. So this talk particularly is about cryptographic fundamentals. Then the next one is about TLS or SSL, if you're more familiar with that term. Third one is about configuring or configuring cryptography, or sort of cryptographic devices and things. And then fourth one is about application use of cryptography. So it kind of starts from the math and goes up through the thing. So the one you're going to be seeing today is the one really related to the math, related to the foundations of it. And again, whether you read the slides on my website or I give it some other time for your organization, I'm not sure. But again, this is just a part, but I think a key part, because understanding this part helps to build an understanding what TLS is, and then how it's used in actual, how it's actually configured and how it's actually used in applications. If you don't understand this part, the other stuff doesn't really add up. And that's one of the reasons, like when I started to study it, I went all the way to the bottom, worked all the way up. So that's what you're going to see right now, is starting from the bottom. So, I mean, let's look at exactly what cryptography is basically going to give us. It's going to give us 3 things, and I know this sounds kind of odd, like why is it 3 different things? But effectively, cryptography is not one thing. It doesn't give you one thing. It gives you 3 different things. And again, this is sort of a philosophical issue, but it becomes practical when you're actually configuring cryptography, because you're trying to figure out, like, what is this going to do? What is this not going to do? Right. Let's see. The first one is authenticity, right? So how do you make the cryptography authentic? How do you determine how do you determine whether a message is in fact properly authenticated, right? And that's one feature that you get from cryptography, okay? The second feature, which is the feature most people think of, is confidentiality, meaning that nobody can see your message. Now you might think, oh, well, that's all I need. Well, maybe not, because if you, just because the message is confidential, nobody can see, it doesn't mean you're sure it's from the person who you think it's from, right? So you don't know who it's from. If you can't verify who it's from, it may not be important whether it's confidential or not, because you're not sure it's actually a valid message, right? And then integrity is the third one, which is again a little fuzzier, where it talks about making sure the message hasn't changed or there hasn't been any modification of the message. So again, a different kind of aspect of looking at, everyone thinks of confidentiality for cryptography, but authenticity, integrity are two other aspects. And non-repudiation is a fourth one that I'm not even going to get into. But again, there are a bunch of things that you get with cryptography, and you have to decide which ones you want. So what are we going to do today? We're going to go through 6 different things, and I'm going to take a break after each one and answer questions. The first one is defining what ciphers and hashes are. These terms are often used interchangeably. It can be confusing. So I'm going to kind of really dig down, use some terms you're familiar with, and we're going to actually go into exactly what these things are. Then we're going to back up a little bit. Sections 2 and 3 are really kind of math primers. I know it's kind of boring, but we have to have those primers to understand the scale of some of the numbers we're working with, and particularly the behavior of prime numbers is pretty important when we get to section 4 and 5, and that is private communication, particularly Diffie-Hellman. We'll talk about that. And then also public-private key communication, RSA, DSA, some of that. So we're going to kind of walk through the basics, get some math lessons, and then kind of come back to it and get very practical at the end. It is hard, so I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of this you're like, "Ow, that was a lot of information." These slides are online. You can kind of study them. You're going to see a lot of URLs in this presentation. So if you're interested in a slide, odds are there is a URL there that will allow you to get more information. I specifically designed these slides so you could go back through them, download them. Almost every URL, you just click on the URL in the PDF and it opens your browser and will give you details about that particular topic. And we'll see that over and over again. So let's talk about the first thing, ciphers and hashes. Let's first talk about a cipher. A cipher is basically a way to take a message and compute a unique ciphertext, which is the same length at the original message and can be reversed. So that concept that you basically take the cipher, you take your message, you pull it through the cipher, something comes out, it's the same length, typically maybe a little longer than the original. Then when you go back, and you can go backward, you can take the ciphertext, take the same secret or maybe a different secret, move it back and get the original. That is what a cipher is. Okay. We don't want to confuse that with hashes. And I'm going to talk about hashes in a minute, but you see people all the time misusing these terms. It is important to distinguish what you're using, because by using the proper terms, you more clearly understand what you're actually doing. Okay. So the most common cipher is AES. It stands for Advanced Encryption Standard. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of URLs here that we can use to get more detail about all of these different features. AES is 128-bit block cipher. It is always the same length as a block. Okay. Now it does support different key lengths, 128, 192, and 256. So you'll see it referred to as AES 128, AES 256. That represents the key lengths. It's not actually the block length, because the block length is always 128. Okay. It uses a very unusual design here called confusion and diffusion. There's a URL that explains exactly what it does. There are no known attacks except for exhaustive search. So that is an ideal kind of cipher. That's why you see it almost everywhere. There's a lot of history of how it was developed. It came out of the Netherlands, as I remember. There's a whole competition for this. Most CPUs, particularly enterprise level CPUs, support AES specific instructions. I have instructions here on how you can determine if your CPU has AES capability, and particularly how to enable it if it isn't enabled. You can even run tests to see if your AES instructions are working or not. So I recommend that if you're doing any kind of performance work. It is an elegant algorithm based on polynomials over finite fields. Again, a link there. There's a lot of question of how secure it is. It is trusted by the U.S. government for top secret communication. I can't say it's trusted around the world. I know that Russia has a ghost protocol that they use for encryption, so that's not universally used. Heavily used in Europe. I don't know about Asia too much in terms of this, but there have been sort of like, are there backdoors to it? I don't think so. If you, in fact, look at the way DES was designed, when the government made changes to it, they made it more secure. So that's some history. I think it's a very good cipher. This is a visual of how it works. It basically walks through this cycle 10 times. So it does 10 runs through this machine here, which basically, as I said, substitutes and diffuses. And again, a very elegant system. There are some very nice videos that people talk about how AES works and why it's useful. There's another aspect of ciphers that I think is important. There are things called cipher modes. You don't see this too much outside of the academic sort of security groups, but it is, I think, an important concept if you're ever doing anything with encryption. And that is, you've chosen AES, but how do you actually use it? There are two ways. You can use it as a block mode, where you're basically encrypting blocks, or you can use it as a stream mode. So, for example, if you're doing SSH, you want to encrypt every byte. You don't want to run every byte through a block cipher. It doesn't make any sense. So you basically create a cipher block and then you XOR it with the bytes. So again, it's block mode, stream mode, two different types of modes. AES can be used for both of them. One of the most common stream modes with AES is CTR mode. This is a stream cipher. And again, at the bottom, it does explain how that stream cipher works. Another very popular one is GCM. GCM is also a stream cipher, except it adds the idea of integrity checking. So it adds something called integrity tag, which can be used to verify that the message was created with the same secret key and not modified. This gets back to slide 3 or slide 2 when we talked about message integrity, message was it secrecy, confidentiality, integrity, and also authentication. So this gives you that ability to say this is actually a valid message because not only is it encrypted, but it has a tag that verifies it was created by somebody who knew the secret. The second type of concept I wanted to work with in this section is hashing. There is encryption or ciphers, which is taking a message and going back and forth in terms of encryption, decryption. And then there is hashes. Hashes are one way. They basically take a variable amount of text and create typically a fixed size hash. Hashes can have collisions because, of course, you're taking a long text and shrinking it down to a smaller number of bits. So there is a calculation there for cache collision. Something like SHA-256 or SHA-384 are indeed bit hashes that take this block and then create a fixed size that represents sort of a distillation of the message. Okay. Here's an example of a hash. As you can see, we have 3 different messages here in blue. Okay. But you've noticed on the right, all the messages are the same length. No matter how long the message input is, the output is always the same length. And that's really the visual I think you have to remember for hashing. Okay. There's also something called a message authentication code. This is sort of a verification code that goes along with the message. So you can have a message, you can encrypt it, and then you attach something called a message authentication code, and that does the integrity and the authentication for you. It validates that the message was created by somebody who knew the secret. So again, you can use all sorts of methods to compute these, but this is basically what it does. And this is the way the MAC works. On the left-hand side is somebody generating the message with the MAC, and the right-hand side is validation. You can also do something called split keys, where you take a key and you break it into parts. So you require two people to know the key to encrypt or decrypt something. Sometimes that's valuable. So do you have any questions yet?
Bruce, I am looking. I don't see any in the chat. Mark Hutchinson had a quick comment, but I don't think it was a question per se.
We're gonna ramp up from here, so that's great.
Yeah, and I'm looking. Give me just a minute. I just want to make sure. I'm just scanning Q&A. I don't see anything in Q&A, and I would encourage everyone on this session. You can pose your questions utilizing the Q&A feature. So please do so moving forward. But thank you.
So now we're going to launch into just the two sections, sections 2 and 3, which are very math heavy, which need to give you the mathematical reminders or foundations to understand 4 and 5. Okay. So don't worry if you're bored. Don't worry if you don't understand why we're here. We got to go here to get to the next. Okay. So reminder here, exponentiation, for example, a to the b is effectively a times a times a, b times. Okay. That's how exponentiation works. 2 to the 5th is 2 times 2 times 2, 5 times, right? Example there. Exponential notation, not 7E9 is 7 with, 9 zeros after it, right? So if you've seen that kind of representation, I'm just reminding you that's what it is, okay? Logarithms effectively allow you to take exponentiation and turn it into multiplication. And multiplication becomes addition when you log it. Again, just some math to remind you how that works. CPU register sizes, just to remind you, 32-bit, 64-bit register sizes, typically, 4 with 4 to the 9th, 4 times 10 to the 9th, 2 times 10 to the 19th are typically the length of those bits. Real world sizes, these are interesting. Just kind of throw them in your back of your head. We're going to see some big numbers coming up. So just keep in mind, some of the numbers we're going to be talking about are as big as the number of atoms in the universe. All right. So just like, when you're starting to talk about cryptography and how secure something is, when you're starting to talk about the number of atoms in the universe, that's a big number, right? So some of these numbers are really big, and I'm trying to show that. So first one, number of seconds in a billion years, right? 3 times 10 to the 16th. Number of atoms in the universe, 1 times 10 to the 80th. Number of possible chess games, 1 times 10 to the 120th. These are big, big numbers, okay? And just sort of throw them back there, right? So AES has 3 times 10 to the 38th combinations, 120-bit key. So that's big, considering the number of atoms in the universe is 3 times 10 to the 16th. This is 3 times 10 to the 38th. Okay. That is a humongous number, right? I'm sorry. Number of seconds in billion years is 1 times 10 to the 16th. Number of atoms in the universe, 1 times 10 to the 80th. You're kind of, whatever. ACDHE, that's Diffie Hellman with elliptic curve. We'll talk about that later. That's getting near the number of atoms in the universe. AES 256, again, getting very close to the number of atoms in the universe, right? See, like these are really big. The RSA key with 128 bits, that's 2 times 10 to the 308th. Wow, that's just humongous. I can't even imagine that. Diffie-Hellman prime, 4 times 10 to the 616th. That's a lot of zeros. Random values when you're randomizing something, they aren't totally random, so you have some collisions there. So the effectiveness is about half the number of bits as you see, but it's still really big. Adding a single bit doubles the strength of something. So if you have 10 bits and you go to 11, you've doubled the strength of that. So considering when you're going from E times, when you're going 128 bit to 256 bit, you're doubling 128 times exponentially. Okay, 2, 4, 8, 6, whatever. So again, really, really big stuff, and we have a video about that if you're curious. Any questions? Probably not.
I'm just looking. I'm not seeing any yet.
Cool.
Nope, I don't think so.
So let's get our second math lesson. My second math lesson is related to primes. This was hard for me to get my head around. Now, fortunately, I was a math teacher, a high school math teacher for 5 years when I got out of college. So I was kind of able to get it in my head, but it wasn't easy. And hopefully this is going to make it easier for you. So a lot of the cryptography uses primes. And you probably have heard about this before, but why do they use primes? What is it about primes that makes it useful? And it really revolves around the concept of modulus. Modulus is effectively saying if I take one number and I divide it into another number, what's the remainder? Now you would think that's a stupid, to me at least, it's kind of a stupid specification. Like, why is that such a key issue? But in fact, that is a key issue for cryptography. So we're gonna explain why that is in a minute. So first, we're going to talk about what's called a generator, a prime generator. So a prime generator or a generator is effectively taking a number, taking it to a certain power, multiplying it by itself over and over again, and then taking a modulus of that number. Now, if I take 6 and I take it to increasing powers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And I modulate with a 7, you can see what happens is I effectively get a 1 and a 6 and a 1 and a 6 and a 1 and a 6. And as I keep increasing the exponential power, I keep getting higher and higher cycles. It just cycles around 1, 6, 1, 6, 1. It just goes over and over again. That's why it's called a generator, because it's effectively generating, it's using a prime or it's using a number and it's modulating against the prime and it's generating basically this kind of cycle, generates a cycle. Now, this is not a very good useful cycle, but this one is. And the reason this one is because 3 is what is called a primitive element of 7. Okay. And I'm not going to get into the issue of what a primitive element is, but it's effectively a prime against another prime. Okay. And what you can see here, and this is kind of fundamental, what you can see here is that as I take 3 to the first, 3 to the second, 3 to the third, I am generating all of the integers below 7 as a full set. So 3, 2, 6, 4, 5, 1. Then you can notice right here, 3 to the 7th repeats over again. 3, 2, and the next one's going to be 6, and the next one's going to be 4. Okay. And that is a very tiny generator that basically just generates all of the integers below a prime. And this is fundamental to most of the things we're going to talk about that relate to elliptical curve and relate to public-private keys. So let's get an example of that. So here, effectively in reverse, you're basically saying that 6 times 10 to the n, so I mean 3 times 6 times n is going to always be 1. And plus 2 is going to be 7, and plus 1 is going to be 3, and plus 4 is going to be 4, but 5 is 5, and 3 is 6. It just kind of cycles around like that. And that's basically a generator. Okay. Another issue is that exponentiation is commutative. So g to the x to the y is the same as g to the x times y, which is same to the g to the y times x, which is same as g to the y to the x. Now, why is this important? What it gives us is a way of interchanging things in different orders. So because of the way the exponentiation works, we can effectively take a number and multiply it by something and then something else in any order. And that is a fundamental issue I'm going to show you in a minute in related to cryptography. Okay. So any questions? We've done with the math. Now we're going to actually walk into the actual kind of meat of the talk.
Bruce, I don't see anything in Q&A.
Great. All right. So let's go at this. I think we're in good shape time-wise. All right.
There's something in chat though. I'm sorry, can I interrupt real quick?
Yes.
Hi, it's Jen. Raymond Portata said, is there a book recommendation by Bruce that covers modern cryptography, if not books?
Yes, so the last slide in this presentation has book recommendations.
Amazing. Okay, thanks.
Great. So let's talk about something that something called Diffie Hellman. I doubt you've heard of Diffie Hellman. You may have seen it as DH in some of, if you've ever looked at the cryptography like protocols that TLS and SSL use. But it is fundamental to pretty much the entire, secure web. And I'm going to kind of explain why that is. It is very interesting. And if you look at some of my other talks, I actually show you how you can see the Diffie-Hellman in action. If you look at the SSL like tags that you get, you might have overlooked either in your server logs, or you can turn on verbose logging. You can see how the system works. So what effectively Diffie-Hellman does is it allows two servers, two clients or whatever, to exchange a secret without the secret ever being visible to anyone in the middle. You think, well, how is that possible, right? How can you make a secret that two people know without anyone seeing it in the middle? And the fundamentals of that is really related to the whole generators of primes that we just talked about. So the basic display here, and again, I have some URLs here at the bottom you can click on. But effectively, you've got Alice and Bob, and they want to have a secret between them, but they don't want anyone in the middle to see the secret. So what happens is that Alice and Bob agree effectively on a G, which is a generator, and a P, which is a prime. Okay, so they just agree, and anyone can see these numbers. These are publicly, factly, as I remember, Diffie-Hellman has only a couple numbers that everyone uses, so they're very public. They're on RFCs. You see them all the time. So then what happens is that Alice generates a random X, and Bob generates a random Y. So we're right on this page right here. We're right here. So Alice does an X, Bob generates a Y. Then Alice computes the generator to her X power that only she knows, and she does modulus P on it, the prime. Okay. And Bob takes his Y, and he takes the generator, takes it to the Y, and then modulates with the P. Now, he doesn't actually do the exponentiation. He uses logarithms, and it's much quicker than, there's all sorts of tricks in how to do quick exponentiation. In fact, he doesn't necessarily use logarithms. He uses this called exponentiation by squaring, or modular exponentiation, which is sort of a quick way of doing very high powered exponentiation. But that's what they do. Alice computes her G to the X mod P and the Y P. Okay. Then what happens is Alice sends her output of G to the X mod P over to Bob, and Bob sends his G to the X to the Y over to Alice. Okay. And Alice receives Bob's, and Bob receives Alice. Okay. And then Alice uses her X to compute G to the X mod P to a power X, which she knows, and she gets a result, and her shared key is G to the X to the Y mod P, and his secret is G to the X, X to the Y mod P. But as we saw earlier right here, it doesn't matter what order we do the X or Y in, right? G to the X, Y, Y to the X. So effectively, these are the same numbers. So what has happened is they have a shared secret now, but they have not exchanged X or Y at all. Yes, they have exchanged G to the X mod P and G to the Y mod P, but P is so large, there's no way for somebody to figure out what X and Y are, because the behavior of the generator is that effectively it generates in such a big field that you can't figure out what number would get you to generate that particular hit. Like with 3 and 7, I could know real quickly, yeah, that one's going to give me a 4. That one's, but when you're talking about numbers with, 50 digits or whatever, it's very hard to figure out how that's all going to work. And that's effectively how Diffie-Hellman works. That's how, when you go to a website, it typically uses Diffie-Hellman to generate a secret between your client and the web server, and it uses that secret to encrypt all of the TLS traffic. Okay. So the result again is g to the y to the x and g to the x to the y, which are the same value. But you can't derive x and y if you see the intermediate values at all. So that is the key to Diffie-Hellman, this designed many decades ago, but again, incredibly important for cryptography and secure communication. If I try to fake it, okay, it's basically it doesn't work. Pretend you can't reverse the modular computation. This is effective. So this is like, we're going to walk through a fake example here. Okay. So you agree on 6 and 7. That's a public thing. Alice agrees on 5. Bob agrees on 4. Right. So you compute 5 plus 6 mod 7, you get 4. You compute 6 plus 5, you get 3. You send the 4, you send the 3, you receive the 3, you receive the 4. Then you do 3 plus 4 is 7 is 0. 3 plus 4 is 7 is 0. So then the shared secret is 0. Now, I realize that's a stupid example, but this is effectively what's happening, is that if we pretend we can't understand this, which we can because it's 7, right? But if these were big numbers and it was exponentiation, you couldn't do this. And that's effectively what is happening with Diffie-Hellman. Here's a real key exchange with exponentiation with our 3 and 7 example. Again, random value 4 and 3. You do 3 to the 3, 3 to the 4. You exchange. You compute 6 to the 4 mod 1, and you compute 4 to the 6 mod p, and you get 1. Shared secrets 1. It's the exact same thing that's going on. We just flipped the values, and they came out the same. Okay. Oh, I know that's kind of weird, but again, just pretend that's the way it works, right? Unpredictability. Why does this modulus generator work? Effectively, what it does, and again, I had to draw these myself because I couldn't find like visuals of exactly how this this sort of modulus generator works. But effectively, what it does is it takes a number line, got the integers, and it basically swings around from one number to another in a very unpredictable pattern until it's hit all of the numbers, and the cycle starts over again. So 3 to the 1 cycles around, 3 to the 2 actually hits 2, 3 to the 2 hits 6, and it basically just cycles along that number line. As to why it does that, I'm not going to get into that. I'm not sure I fully understand it. But effectively, this kind of number generator is a property of primes. Here's a full visual on how it works. It's basically bouncing around the number line. Okay. And it's bouncing on the number line in a way that's unpredictable to somebody who doesn't know exactly what the previous one is. Like if I look at this value, can I predict where it came from? No, it could have come from here. It could have come from here. There's really no way. Now, this example, it's easy, but if it was a very large number, there's no way knowing what it came from. It kind of, because it's cycling around a number line, it's really impossible to, it's what's called a trapdoor function, effectively, because there's no way to figure out how you got there. To compute lesser, exactly, while it's computationally easy to compute higher exponents from a given modulus, it's computationally impossible to compute lesser exponential moduli. And that is the trick that we're talking about there. You can go forward, but you can't go backward very easily. Very interesting. Similar concept is discrete logarithms in a finite field. This is effectively another method of doing exponentiation, except with logarithms. And it's sort of showing you that how this works. And again, it's called a Galileo's field, where it basically cycles around. A finite field where logarithms, you can't undo it. You can't reverse out the previous value. Okay. I think this is the best slide in some ways for Diffie-Hellman. It explains how you can compute values independently without knowing what the other side has done. So you're basically taking colors and you're adding colors to paints, and you can't really predict, like you can send a paint color, but you can't figure out how you got there. But again, at the bottom, you have a common color. So that's effectively what's going on. You start with a common color, you add your own color, and then you swap colors, and then you basically you add your private color, and you get the same color. So visually, I think this is really helpful. Elliptic curve, this takes it to kind of the next level. It's very similar to normal Diffie-Hellman, because again, you have public and private. You have public generator, you have a public prime. Computation commutativity is the same. However, the way elliptic curve is done is you've got points on elliptic curve rather than being linear. So rather than moving on a number line, you're actually be able to compute numbers as tangents to an elliptic curve. And I have some slides visually to show it to you. So effectively, you're doing two-dimensional computation, and it allows you to use much larger values and much more efficient. So again, public constants A and B are typically defined. Again, look at that URL if you're curious about the constants people use. Abelian group is a very common way of picking the P and the G for elliptic curve. The elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman exchange is a little different. You basically generate a random number each side. Starting from one generator point, they use point doubling and addition to simulate moving the point their random number of times on the elliptic curve. They transmit their new points to each other, and then they use receiving point, and they use the same elliptic curve movement, and they end up at the same final point, which is effectively the new secret. So instead of using number line, you're using curves. So again, they use the X component as a result to derive the shared secret. So let's look exactly what this looks like. Instead of using exponentiation, you're typically using doubling and addition. So it's a combination of doubling and addition. So any similar number like 71 is effectively doubling and some additions. And that's all you're doing, and it's obviously very efficient. So again, you start your generator, you double it to get 2G, you double it again. To do addition, you do tangent, and you effectively are drawing reflections on a line. So let's look at exactly, this is literally an elliptic curve. I had to draw this myself. I couldn't find any good descriptions. But effectively what you do is you start with the point G, which is right here, okay? And you get a tangent on G, and you look at where it intersects the elliptic curve, and then you find the reflection point, and that's your double of that G. So this is G, this is twice G, okay? Again, doubling, if I'm 8G here and I use my tangent and then reflect, that's where my 16G ends up on the elliptic curve. Here's addition. If I want to add, I want 3G. So I find G, I find 2G, and the point in the middle where they intersect the elliptic curve, the reflection of that is an addition of G. So all we can do in elliptic curve is double and add. That's all we can do. But again, because it's binary operations, that's sufficient. Here is 24. I start with 32G, and I find 24, and then the intersection of that would be 96. So you kind of get idea of how you do doubling here between 64 and 32. That's double of that, and that's the 96 there. Okay. Adding 1, you effectively are, again, this graph's getting really complicated, but effectively here's my 96, and I can find the reflection and then find out where that hits on the G, and that gives me 95. So it basically adds or subtracts 1 from the number I'm working on. So that's effectively the way elliptic curve works. I know it's kind of hard to understand, but visually, This is the reason that you can use much larger numbers with elliptic curve, because the type of computation you're doing is much more efficient. Okay. This is a slide I got from somebody. It's trying to show you how the prime elliptic curve distribution of 61 kind of bounces around in an elliptic curve. It's kind of hard to see, but these dots, the order, they kind of randomly bounce around this number line from 0 to 60. Okay. It's the same kind of concept. You're bouncing around within all the values less than 61, but very hard to predict. Okay. So Diffie curve requires less computation than standard Diffie-Hellman. A 224-bit elliptic curve is as strong as a 2000-bit standard Diffie-Hellman. So again, this is why you see it a lot, and we have some videos here if you're curious about exactly why elliptic curve is so popular. Any questions?
Bruce, I've got about 4.
Okay.
So this goes back to 1244. So a number of slides ago, Mark Hutchinson says, how do they agree on G and P? How do they, in quotes?
Yeah, so
quotes
G and
around
P are
agree?
completely public. Most websites use the same G and P everywhere. Every client, if you look at your G and P for your browser, it's probably using the same constant all the time. And they're publicly distributed. They're on RFCs. Everyone knows them. The G and the P are not the issue, are not the secrets. It's the exponents that are the secrets. The G and the P are called Albion groups, and you can look at why they're important. But effectively, there's nothing secret about them at all.
All right. Raymond asked, with the deprecation of TLS 1.2, does this mean we only have one, and in parentheses, TLS 1.3 left? Is there anything coming down the pipe to support us if TLS 1.3 is also compromised related to Diffie-Hellman, or is this something different?
Yeah, that would be something I have in the next slide deck, which is only about TLS. So I go into all the details why TLS 1 and 1.1 were deprecated. I think 1.2 and 1.3 are very solid. So we may need a 1.4 at some point. But I think the crypto community's learned quite a bit now, and we know a lot more about what's safe and what isn't than we did before. So I'm hopeful we'll be better at it, but I don't know that.
Paul G asks, is any of this math in threat from quantum computing before the development of remediations against such an attack?
Yes, and I do cover that in some of the later ones. You do see people using AES 256 now. AES 128 is secure against traditional cryptographic attacks, but you see a lot more people using larger key sizes to prevent quantum cryptographic breakage. And that's pretty standard. Probably all of the movement toward larger key sizes has really been driven by concerns about quantum cryptography.
Very good. So that's 3 questions. We have a total of 7. Yep. If you like, we could save the remainder of the questions maybe and just give you a chance to do a little further. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I'll stay as long as you want to answer questions, but we should probably get through the remaining. I think we have 14 slides left. So let's just kind of get that done, and then we'll spend as much time as people want. So this is kind of the last big section, and it relates to public-private key. Remember, we talked about AES, right, which is a cipher, standard cipher, symmetric cipher. We talked about hashing, right? We did some math. We talked about that. We talked about Diffie-Hellman and the ability to exchange secrets. We talked about elliptic curve. Now we're going to talk about public-private key communication, okay? Particularly RSA, which, again, Diffie-Hellman negotiates a secret, right? Uses a public G and a public P. Each client generates their own secret, but RSA uses a different method. It's used more to communicate a message. The message is the exponent base effectively. And the public modulus N is the product of 2 primes. So in RSA, instead of having a public prime that everyone knows, you have the product of 2 primes, which is public. Okay. And the two primes themselves are secret. Okay, so the product of 2 primes is public in RSA, whereas in Diffie-Hellman, the primes are kind of public and the exponents are private, right? In RSA, the primes are public, but the product of the two primes is the primes are private. The product of the two primes are public, and the reason that's important is that the primes are so big that it's very hard to figure out from the product what the two primes are, like virtually impossible. So effectively, Diffie-Hellman has one exponent that is public and another exponent that's private, and you effectively raise the message to the power of E and then D, or in reverse order, and that returns the original message. So this is more of a method of doing cryptography. It's a little of having a secret that's a little more just different, because in Diffie-Hellman, you're doing it live. Okay, you're computing the secret, the shared secret live. With RSA, you are computing your public and private on your own. All right, that's why you see the two of them used differently. One party controls the private key, the other party can know the public key. So that's the big difference between with Diffie-Hellman, both of them know the private key, and it's got to happen live. With RSA, you can you generate your private key and your public key. Your public key can be given to anybody, and your private key remains your own. Okay. It does encryption, it does signing, which is authentication. So again, going back to a little bit of the math, it uses Fermat's theorem, that effectively when you take M and you raise it to the power of P, or P minus 1, and you do mod P, the result is always 1. Okay. And if you take M and you multiply that, it becomes multiplied by the 1, you get M again, and then you take M minus 1 and you get M as well, and M to the P is also M. So this allows exponentiation in a modulus field to return the base value. Now, I know this sounds kind of weird, but it's very similar to what we did with the number line. It kind of loops around within that space. But the way that this exponentiation works, we can basically, if we know the secret, we can decrypt, we can encrypt the message, but anyone with the public key can decrypt the message, but they don't know the pieces, so they can't compute P minus 1, so they can't decrypt it. They can't encrypt it, basically. Okay. So again, P minus 1 is 1, P n to the K times P minus 1 is 1. I know this is really kind of weird, hard to explain. But again, exponentiation in a modulus field is cyclic. So multiple exponent values return the same result. You basically end up kind of looping around. So effectively what it does, it loops around in this huge field. And only somebody who knows both primes can effectively operate in that space. Okay. When you use two primes, that's when it gets interesting, because as I said before, with RSA, you create two primes, you multiply them together, that's your public key. But you never want to give anyone the two private keys that made it up. So effectively, this is getting back to Euler's theorem from 1763, again, way, way back. You're basically looking at some very complicated math, which allows you to compute the original message if you know what the two primes are. This is why when you give somebody the M, if I can go back here, when you give somebody the M, when you give somebody the product, they can compute an encrypted message, but they can't decrypt it. Only somebody who knows the two primes can compute P minus 1 and Q minus 1 together and then add 1 to it to get the original message. If you just know P and Q, the product of the two, you can't find the exponent that does this trick, is what basically is going on. You can take M and you can multiply it by P and exponent by P, exponent by Q as a product, and you can encrypt it, but you can't decrypt it. And that's why RSA is efficient, because you can encrypt messages without knowing the decryption key. And that is the fundamental value of that feature. So again, this sort of concept of how that works the way the cycle works. Okay. So how do you create a pair? Instead of using P and Q directly to compute an exponential pair that will return M, we choose a small exponent E and compute the exponent of D that will return M. So we do some math here, Chinese remainder theorem, and we get our P and Q, and then we compute our basically public private key for RSA. This is some math to kind of explain how that works. Notice we're taking Q minus P minus 1 and Q minus 1, and then modding it by this. This is the public key, P times Q. Everyone can know that, but they can't undo it. And this is an example of how the cycle works, right? You're cycling around as you're doing the calculation. No matter what order you do it in, you get the answer. So for example, I can give somebody one of the product of the two, and they can compute an encryption value, but they can't separate it out to sort of undo it. So summary of this, base values raised to a specific exponent with modulus return the original value. So M to the P, mod P always returns the original value. Multiple exponents can do this, so you can kind of cycle around with that. When using modulus, that is the product of two primes, finding the exponent that returns the base value is hard to compute using just the modulus. So again, very similar to the finite field we talked about before. You can go forward in the cycle easily, but you can't go backward without knowing some of the numbers. So this is kind of the sort of the concept of how that works. If you're working with RSA, you have an N, which is the product of your two primes, okay? And your N is your modulus. And you also have an E, which is also public to everybody. So your N, your product of two primes, and your exponent that you use are public. However, the D is private, which is one of the exponents you use, and the primes P and Q are also private. And particularly P minus 1 and Q minus 1, which is used to compute D, that's absolutely private because that's what you use to do the decryption, okay? Another aspect of RSA, they use much bigger key sizes. So again, 2000 bits is typical for RSA because it's not as secure as an AES type of system. So you have to use really big numbers to do it. Application of RSA, what you can basically do is, remember I said that the E is public and the N is public. So you can effectively encrypt a message by taking the message, raising it to the power of E, doing a modulus of N, and returning an encrypted result. However, as I said, D is private. So if you take your encrypted value and you use your private key, you can then return the original message. You don't need the D to create an encrypted message. You only need the D to create a decrypted message. In the opposite way, if you want to sign something, you can use D, which is the private, to sign it. And if you do, the E can be used to generate a hash to verify if it's actually a valid signature or not. All right. So sort of an opposite case here. When you encrypt, you're using like the E, when you're encrypted using the E, okay. But when you sign something, you're using a D, the private key, and a hash. And then now the E is used to verify the signature. So it's kind of interesting. It does two things, right? It encrypts, but also allows signature. And usually you see both of them used together with RSA. So in conclusion, cryptography gives us authenticity, confidentiality, and integrity, okay? I promised additional areas for study. This first YouTube video is a 9-part series, okay, about cryptography. Again, feel free to just click on it. It'll pull up your browser and allow you to view those 9 very good lessons. Again, this is from a professor in Edinburgh, and this is his website, okay? Cryptographic books, I recommend 3, Niels Ferguson, Bruce Schneier, Cryptography Engineering, Design Principles, Practical Applications. Very good practical work on that. Understanding Cryptography, a textbook, is obviously more scholarly. and understanding the protocols. Bruce Schneier, Applied Cryptography, again, more historical, but a broad overview of cryptography in general, not just the algorithms and so forth. And that does conclude our talk. I went a little over, but I appreciate being able to kind of present this to you. Imagine if we had another 40 slides or 60 slides to go through, everyone would be like, yeah. So again, good to just get this primer out of the way at least. And hopefully you have a better understanding of exactly how this stuff works.